You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
And we are back in studio with Alexis Walkenstein. For those who didn't join us for our last episode of Trending, you can find it online. Alexis is the co-producer of the film Unplanned. And Alexis, you gave us the inside scoop in the last episode about the huge release and censorship in Canada.
Yeah, we opened in the United States March 29th. It was a surprise box office hit. And after the American domestic open, we were really working to fulfill the clamor for Unplanned around the world. And Canada was one of those hotbed locations where it's very dark when it comes to the culture of life versus the culture of death. Much more restrictions there, treacherous, with regard to abortion. And so there was so much opposition to get in. We didn't have a distributor right away. There was just so much coming against us. And it was hard to believe that Canada was our first country internationally where Unplanned would emerge. And you know what? It was another surprise box office. It was a small box. We had a little over 50 screens, but we did the highest per screen average in all of North America. It was the second highest per screen average in all of North America for that weekend, which is unheard of. We heard stories of people waiting in line for 6 hours for tickets. Theaters are sold out everywhere. This coming weekend, going into the second weekend, we're hearing about a town of 30,000 where that particular theater is totally sold out. And stories of people having major conversions and healings in the theater, people who are either had their own abortion or helped, were complicit with having friends get abortions, seeing this film and just becoming really undone to become renewed. Mm-hmm. And these types of stories are coming in. We're hearing emails of lives being changed, hearts being changed, minds being changed. And what was coming against us for ill, it became a great good.
I just think about the individual lives that have not only been changed but saved. You shared with me on the live Instagram video in between our last segment show of segments how the 15-year-old boy ended up saving the life of a baby of one of his classmates.
In Los Angeles, we had a religious order of nuns who hosted a private screening. And this is the power of the church coming together to collaborate with Hollywood. These types of movies cannot be just made by filmmakers or because of Abby Johnson or because of the great acting, but it's contingent upon all of us as the body of Christ to work together to change the culture. And I just want to say a shout out to all of the people like the different religious orders and priests and parishes and the USCCB and bishops and pro-life groups who literally put their money where their mouth is and put their elbow grease into this to say, we're going to stand with you. We're going to help raise up this film to our communities and bring this message of hope and healing.
Coming up on the show, Alexis Walkenstein is also an Emmy Award-winning journalist, so we'll be diving into a little bit of her experience living also the single years joyfully in a world that doesn't really wait. And so we'll be diving into the topic of being single and joyful and chaste. But also, I'm hearing a lot of people, Alexis, who are saying, okay, specifically high school students, some who are really emboldened, they're now talking, some people who are having major conversion of heart, but others were saying, my heart has changed. I don't know how to talk about this still. So we'll be diving into one of those areas and how to respond to the rape question that always comes up in a pro-life argument. Because you can always tell stories about Unplanned, you can cite statistics, but you do need to know how to respond to that rape question. That's difficult. So
it's difficult.
That'll be coming up. I want to talk about effective communication, living by principles of truth, beauty, goodness in the world. One of the great communicators, which, by the way, Alexis is an author of a book about Fulton Sheen, now blessed, soon to be, is it proper word, canonized a saint?
He's going to be beatified first. So blessed is the second to last level of sainthood. So the Vatican approved a miracle validating that a woman in Peoria, his little boy who was stillborn for over an hour, no vital signs. And she cried out to Fulton Sheen for this miracle. that miracle and all the interviews and testimony from the medical community and the faith community went to the Vatican, and they have affirmed that this is a bona fide miracle, paving the way for Bishop Sheen to be Blessed Sheen. Right. His beatification will be in the United States at a date to be announced, and we're all waiting.
And that's now 8-year-old James Fulton, who 61 minutes after stillborn birth ends up being resuscitated and lives through the intercession of Blessed Fulton
No
Sheen.
brain damage, nothing wrong with him.
It is incredible. They have an upcoming book. I think it's 61 Minutes to Hope or to Life.
Their book I think its pre-orders are out now, and I have it in my inbox. Like, I have it to read in preview, so I'm really excited to knowing the story, but then seeing it in a dramatic telling. I'm excited for that.
So being in journalism, working on some of these major Christian films that have been coming out over the years, including Unplanned, you have really seen the importance of effective communication of faith, of principles having to do with life and sexuality. Sure. And you've really taken Fulton Sheen as a model for an effective communicator. What stood out to you?
Well, I think, his boldness into really evangelize in season and out of season. I mean, he was the master to be able to take very lofty, heavenly truths and to bring them into an understanding for the world to be able to receive very simply. So these profound truths he was able to unpack and deliver with clarity and with wisdom and with a joy that could really kind of hit people between the eyes, especially if you're living in sin, or especially if you just kind of doubt, what is this bishop with this cape saying, but he had this ability to penetrate all levels of society, every economic strata, every type of race. I mean, he was a missionary, and he was able to communicate with absolutely everybody and use the dawn of radio and television to do so.
So he was on national television, secular national television, with a weekly show that I'm forgetting the name of it all of a sudden.
Life is Worth Living.
Life is Worth Living. And he had a radio show as well. And so here is, like you're saying, modern means of communication to spread the gospel.
Right.
And he did it so effectively. You can even go today, head to YouTube and watch some of his Life is Worth Living shows. You can watch the old shows. They're fantastic. They're one of my favorite things to take with me on a journey and driving as well.
Yeah, he's funny, and he's full of wisdom and seriousness and prophetic, at times very hauntingly prophetic. So I just love him, and it's not just the physical presentation of what he brings, but I really experienced the power of his spiritual friendship and his intercession during my time of need as a communicator working in the Diocese of Palm Beach and needing to be able to represent the church well. I didn't want to misstep. I wanted to use the forum to educate and instruct, because oftentimes I was interfacing with mainstream journalists and mainstream publications. So how do you bridge the gap between the sacred and the secular, so to speak, and have a communication that's persuasive but full of truth?
Absolutely. And Bishop Sheen does that. He intercedes when you ask him to. And I think that testimony of just James Fulton, 8 years old, and here we are in a time where communication is so difficult, so heated, conversations are being shut down, censorship of Unplanned. We need saints like him in the church today.
Exactly. And the world, for some reason, was not afraid of a religious message. I mean, the show is called Life is Worth Living, and people could really derive from that, whether they were Christian or atheist, really the fundamentals, the keys for having a life worth living and to be set free.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book? I know it's available on Amazon. We'll tweet out to it, but it's titled Fulton J. Sheen.
It's titled Fulton J. Sheen. It's from Pauline Media's Ex Libris series, which is basically a new series to unpack the wisdom of saints and saints to be. And it was really interesting. I was working on a film, and on the night of the premiere, an acquisitions editor that I never met said that my name came up at an editorial meeting. They wanted me to compile a book on Bishop Sheen. And I knew it was a response to my own prayer. God was about to move me to Hollywood, and Fulton Sheen was really the intercessor behind all my movements. And so it was like a big stamp of validation. And the book is a compilation. It's very pithy. So it's dense, but you can really pick it up and put it down. It's kind of for our ADD culture. It's broken down into 5 sections. And because I really prayed and I asked the Lord, what does the world need through Fulton Sheen today? What does the culture need? I don't want it to be just the obvious about Fulton Sheen, but what are the hidden things that he brings to restore the culture and renew the culture of the church, families, individuals? And the Lord really downloaded to me the major topics. And they are basically the fire of God, how God pursues a soul, human freedom, because isn't that something that we struggle with every day? How much freedom do we have? The greatest gift that we give back to God is our own surrender and our own free will. So there's a whole section on human freedom, divine love. So the ways that we, encounter Christ in his love and through matrimony and marriage, through to get married, human sexuality, vocation, and then sin, because our culture has basically scrubbed the word sin from our vocabulary because we can do anything, going back to human freedom, it's anything goes. So bringing back to the fore for the church, the concept of sin and how we separate ourselves from the friendship of Christ and how to get back into friendship with him through confession and repentance. And then finally, knowing Jesus, how do we encounter Christ? What Fulton Sheen says about encountering Christ and where did he encounter Christ?
Absolutely. It's powerful. So you can find it on Amazon, Fulton J. Sheen, and it has, I'm sure, reflections by you along with much of his own writings that you really compiled together for people to reap the benefits from. Yeah.
And you can get it also at Pauline.org. If you have a Pauline bookstore in your area, you could visit the Media Nuns. I wasn't sure exactly what the connection was when I was approached by the Media Nuns to do the book, but I found out on my book tour that Bishop Sheen, who did a daily holy hour when he was in New York, his parish straddled his two parishes that he operated from straddled the Pauline Media bookstore, and they had an adoration chapel, and he had his own key. So the nuns gave him his own key to be able to adore the Lord in their bookstore in Manhattan. And so I met one of the nuns who knew him and could testify to that. So I knew Fulton Sheen was behind the connection of having the Daughters of St. Paul put this little book together.
Wow, that's incredible. You can find it on Amazon, at Pauline Bookstores, and on their website. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. That is Alexis Walkenstein, author, incredible communicator, co-producer of Unplanned, and an absolute joy to have in studio. Alexis, I wanted you to join me in taking some questions from listeners.
Sure.
We're in the midst of beach body time, and sometimes beach body time that so many people are working for leads to really difficult circumstances, not just for the women, but also for men, especially in a culture that has been so pornified. So it's making it increasingly more difficult for young men to avoid lustful thoughts.
Beaches, how about The Office?
Oh, that's true.
I used to have to send interns home that were wearing like thongs that you could see when they bent over. It's beaches, it's everywhere, right?
I still can't understand the cheeky shorts. Like, I'll see parents walking with their kids. I'm like, does the parent know her butt cheeks are hanging out? Because I'm sure she's aware that she's flaunting it, but does her mother know? Right. So some of the questions that have come up surround essentially avoiding sin. And I love that these were written in because, like, how far do we go, essentially? So the first question is, if I struggle with lust, should I even go to the beach at all? I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
That's really hard. I mean, you can't avoid what kind of beach are you going to, first of all? Okay, I think that's the first question is, if you're in Christ and you're a new person in Christ and a new creation and you're trying to avoid the negation of sin, are you going to South Beach? Are you going to Venice Beach? Or are you going to go somewhere that maybe it's a little bit more secluded? You can avoid the ocean, or there's families, and you go at the end of the day, and if you know you have a problem, obviously, like, we can't take ourselves out of the world. We would become a cult if we do that. We have to be able to train our eyes, and it's called having custody of the eyes.
Amen. That's what
I really believe that even in the midst of, some of the things that confront us, we can have custody of the eyes,
Right.
And where do we look? What are we looking at? What are we focusing on? And our prayers every day in the sacramental life that we marry ourselves to are going to be the strength that we have to avoid the near occasion of sin. But I think we can take little precaution. And this is not to make us like living in some Catholic bubble. Please, we can't do that. But we can take some precautions and say, okay, like, am I going to go to this racy beach, or am I going to go to something that's a little bit more modest? Am I going to go enjoy something on the water and do this and enjoy the things that I love, the beauty of creation? Or am I going to put myself in a hot mess of a situation that could really be my downfall?
Right. I mean, I live right above Black's Beach in San Diego. It's known as the nude beach. There's a reason that I avoided going to the beach there. That's one area that I would say, you should probably outright avoid that.
If you know that, then, go somewhere else.
Right. But I'm also going to look at this really with you, and I know you're saying the same thing, custody of the eyes, but what point are you putting yourself personally in the near occasion of sin? Because if you really have struggled with pornography, you really struggle with lust, maybe you need to take a season away from the beach.
Maybe you do.
In order to develop that custody of the eye, so that when you are confronted with it in this culture, which is almost unavoidable
It's almost unavoidable. At the beach, the workplace, I mean, we see all kinds of manner of dress out in the world where people do not reverence the body. And it's the less is more instead of more being more. More covered up is really more like the classy approach. I think people who are modest become such a contradiction. And what women don't know is that modesty doesn't mean Amish. Modesty does not mean, you're wearing a bag. Modesty can be the most exquisitely elegant, gorgeous, mysterious part of a woman. We need to, as women, instill that in women, and it's not man's fault. I mean, I think women play a huge role in this, in the way that we over-sexualize ourselves, in the way that we attention seek, and in ways that we think that we need to be to attract something which is not of God. I mean, we need to retrain all of our thinking around this. And it's, good intentioned people can have the same kind of attitude. My own grandmother would be like, if you got it, flaunt it, and, Catholic woman, but it's like, okay.
And you still kind of can, but there's a balance. That's Alexis Walkenstein. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. This custody of the eyes, though, taking a season away. Yes. And, I will throw this in there as we come to the next question. We have to remember, Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And I'm not telling you to pluck out your eyes. There's a reason that some of the church fathers were not canonized saints specifically, because they've gone too far in applying the letter of that law there. But how far are we going? One of the questions asks, and supporting an environment of half-naked women. Right. And I think that there's a difference, for example, between, and we've talked about this on Trending, watching Game of Thrones and giving your eyeball viewership to Game of Thrones, and going to the beach where you're not intentionally going to seek out these specifically, scantily clad, essentially like right in front of you, versus if you're watching Game of Thrones, what's in that show. We know what's coming. There's a big difference.
There's a difference. I mean, you might be confronted and you didn't intend to be confronted with that. And, there are quick prayers you can say, okay, Lord, cover my eyes. You can look away. I mean, there's all this kind of stuff. I mean, also, let's face it, idleness is the devil's playground. How often are you hanging at the beach? Like, let's do some work for the Lord. Let's do some service for the Lord.
Take a book to the beach.
Find a way to find the beach in a way that glorifies God without being caught up in the spirit of the world. These are not easy situations, I will say.
I agree.
These are not easy situations. This is a higher level of spirituality that comes over time. So if anyone's listening to this thinking, that's a cup of crazy, it might seem that way. But when you are growing in the spiritual life and going up the ladder of faith, of perfection, he asks things of us that are part of mortification, to lay some things down. It could be like a fast. Sometimes he asks us to give things up that are food, that are pleasure, but it could be something that could cause us to sin. That's even bigger deal. I mean, we don't want to be in any kind of near occasion of sin, right?
Absolutely. So know yourself. Know the situation you're in. Know where you're putting your money, where you're putting your support. There's a difference between supporting and funding something, even funding it with your eyeball power of watching a certain movie and TV shows. But you really have to know yourself. And I'll leave you kind of on this topic. I was just with Dr. Jerry Nadal, who's molecular microbiologist, and he's a professor on college and university campuses. And he's saying, I know my colleagues probably make fun of me, wondering, geez, Nadal, why do you have your eyes staring down at the pavement as you walk across campus? Yes. But he said, I know personally that I need to do that to honor my wife, and in fact, to honor the young women who are flaunting things on campus. So you need to know yourself. And I think that although people say, well, I can watch Game of Thrones and be perfectly fine. Okay, but you can't watch these scenes and then you're supporting something. There's a difference between that, I think, and really trying to avoid the near occasion when you're going to the beach and you're, maybe limiting your time. Custody of the eyes is so important.
Custody of the eyes is important. And I think as women, we've been in situations where we see men do that, look down or look away, and you're kind of like, what is going on? Like, do I have the plague? And you don't realize that they are, protecting themselves or protecting, their covenant, their sacrament, their marriage. And we have to respect that. And that, I think we have to learn to, like, theology of the body. Yeah. We have to look at the good of God's creation and not be offended by it. But we are in such a pornified culture. It's like the heat's been turned up. So there's a lot of things that are tantalizing to people. And this is not just for men. This is for women, too. Women are as addicted to pornography as men right now. And we've heard priests say that, in confession, they're hearing that. So we have to just do better with how we present ourselves for the glory of God and be gentle with each other.
In conclusion, I'll throw this in there. Another question came out. Should I feel guilty if I'm seeing other people's bodies and, instead of my spouse? And I'll say this. especially as men, you are going to struggle with images popping into your head, the images of women. Your mind may begin to wander, but it's what you do with those images.
It's what you do with the thoughts,
and how far you go. And that's the strength that you need to develop within. So if you have to take that season away from certain things in order to develop that custody of the mind and the eyes, do it to avoid the near occasion of sin. We should be fighting to remain in a state of grace. And so I commend you for asking these questions. I challenge you to live it by how you need to make the changes necessary.
Right. And not everybody has that issue. I mean, to some people, that this whole thing might seem ludicrous.
Right.
And it's because you don't have that issue, but you might have another issue. So we have to be gentle with people and help them to be gentle with themselves.
Absolutely. I want to touch for a second here. That's Alexis Walkenstein. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I've posted this video on my social media. You can find me Trending with Timmerie, or Timmerie, it's just Timmerie, because I want you to watch this video of a 10-year-old girl named Casey from London. She was suspended from school for a week along with another classmate. In this short video, she breaks through to the issue of forced transgender pro-gay communication on her campus and says, basically, since all this education has been occurring, but now people are confused. If they're saying they're bisexual and trans, it's because they're confused. And she goes on to say, before this happened, they were completely confident in who they were, but they're not anymore. And she's saying, and she even says this 10-year-old girl, even 4-year-olds are confused because it's being forced on them in school.
Yep. Yeah, I've heard of this. I've heard many instances of this. And I think it's really a season of parents taking custody of your children. They are your greatest treasure. They belong to God. You are the custodian until you return them back to heaven. If you think it's light or funny or politically correct, and just go along, get along, check yourself, because this is very serious. This could be life-altering for our young people. The confusion and the twisting and the open doors that this brings in, this kind of train of thought that is apart from Christian thought, is something that needs to be really dealt with. And
to hear a 10-year-old cutting through the garbage
and
saying, this is causing kids to lose confidence. What are we doing, people?
Young people that have to actually think in this way, this young, that's child abuse.
It is child abuse. And this is why pediatricians are speaking out against this. This is why endocrinologists are speaking out against this. I mean, in the state of California, you got to listen to this, because this may not be in your state yet, but it is coming. We are having elementary school kids being forced to participate in coloring book sheets that are drawing things having to do with sexuality, gender ideology. And they're being told, you're not a boy, you're not a girl.
Also in California, you probably saw this story about the little girls with condom races. They had to race each other to bring condoms to the anatomy of a male and, put it on with the little boys cheering. This is the kind of stuff where homeschool all the way. I mean, I never had this attitude, but I am like, how do you take a pure, innocent child and put them in this compromised situation and destroy their soul?
Parents, all adults, we need to wake up. And Christ is very clear. There is a great punishment for those who cause the littlest of us among us to sin. And this is a really big deal. And I look at this 10-year-old girl, Casey. She shares her story, but in addition to the story that she shares, what happened is essentially this agenda is being pushed on them. They're being pressured to basically color LGBTQ pictures. And one of the other boys next to her actually begins to speak up, a 10-year-old kid, and she and one of the others starts talking about how back home where they're from, Africa, she's Jamaican, people would die for this. People would be killed. Now, she wasn't saying that they should be killed, but she's saying if this were to occur where they came from, this wouldn't be okay. And so now the school teachers are trying to say that the kids are saying these people should die, these people should be punished. They are now using an agenda not only to force it upon kids, confuse them, but now they're trying to punish them for even saying something to the contrary. Right.
Well, we have a problem overall in our culture and in the church, because overall the church has been very poor in its instruction and persuasive ability to evangelize on sexuality. The root of all of this is confusion over who we are as sons and daughters of God and the purpose of sexuality to be within marriage. And that's first and foremost. So the church has been so remiss on teaching waiting And the problem here is now it's a free-for-all everywhere. And there's absolutely no moral objection to these topics because of the fear of not being able to be politically correct or whatever. And so we have got to get a spiritual backbone on all these topics and let our light shine and be contradiction to the world. Even if we are the only 1, 2, or 10 in our community, we have to represent Christ because these are the times in which it is urgent.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
Emmy Award-winning journalist Alexis Walkenstein is in studio with us. A little later on in the show, we've been talking a lot about, living your faith in the workplace, code of ethics, but she's going to be talking about living your single life in a world that really doesn't wait and is quite impatient. So that's coming up. In the meantime, Alexis, you are the co-producer behind Unplanned. You are seeing the conversions taking place worldwide, having to do with the life issue and the lives that are saved. But we also have people who are struggling to still engage the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I want to dive into the topic of how do you respond to the rape question, for example.
That's a tough one.
But before we go there, you yourself have a story of being a little bit of an unplanned pregnancy.
No, I don't.
Of being your parent, I thought that.
Well, my mom.
You were an unplanned pregnancy.
No, I wasn't.
You were?
My mom had my sister when she was 15 and a half.
Your sister was unplanned.
I grew up in the culture of just looking at women through the lens of my mom's experience of being pregnant as a teenager and then understanding women and what they go through.
Right.
Just because you choose to have the baby doesn't mean that it's an easy life.
Right.
We have to stay with women for as long as
necessary.
As long as necessary. And I think my mom is just such a hero to me. I mean, I can't imagine my life without my sister or her children. Right. But growing up in that environment of understanding the choice for life. I mean, talk about a choice, but choosing life, you know, and not wanting to stunt your own life, your education, all of your choices after this change, everything changes. And my dad came into the mix and adopted my sister, when she was 4.
Oh, God.
And so seeing the radical selflessness of him to be like another St. Joseph, to kind of take up the baton. He wanted children so badly, and this was not an impediment for him.
Right.
So so I wasn't. I was, I guess.
You're like, I was planned.
I was planned in the sense of, my mom was told she could never have kids after my sister.
Wow.
And they prayed, and my mom begged God and said, so that Marie won't be alone.
Oh.
And so the doctors told her she was insane when she said, I'm actually pregnant. And they said, you're not pregnant. You're ill. You're mentally ill. And she said, no, I'm pregnant. I know my body. I'm pregnant.
Wow.
And so she said that, that was a miracle, but it was not so much for them, but she really wanted another baby for my sister. So we're 8 years apart. And so for me, this has been a mission. Doing Unplanned is a mission of love. I also know that there have been abortions in my own bloodline and my family. And so as an act of reparation for, sin in the bloodline, and also just to honor women who have been like my mom, and have suffered the consequences of their error, but that God works miraculous good out of it, a life, a beautiful life, a better than beautiful life. My sister is the most beautiful, talented woman that I looked up to my whole life, and I can't imagine life without her.
Well, and I look at the gift of your life that your mom was told she could never have children, and it's a light and it's a glimmer of hope for people who are suffering infertility as well. That's true. And pressing in, for the impossible. Pray for that gift, that miracle. I want to talk about the rape issue. So many people, I think that, for years, this has been at the heart of the abortion debate, and it's been the justification in many reasons for legal abortion. And we also live in a time where many young girls are engaging in sex. It's consensual, but it's also not wanted, especially among high schoolers.
Right.
And so we've got to be able to respond to this rape question. At times we can, say, okay, how about we talk about the other 99% of abortions that aren't for rape, incest, or healthy mother? But we have to hit the question as well. And so I wanted to tell a story in a little bit about one woman's experience in having been raped. But here are some important things to remember. Not even the rapist receives the death sentence, the death penalty for having raped the woman. Not only that, in many cases, in the statutory rape instances, we're destroying the evidence. Planned Parenthood has been caught red-handed destroying the evidence as soccer coaches, older stepbrothers, foster parents are taking in minors to receive an abortion after having been sexually abused.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these are very difficult realities. I mean, what's the percentage of those who've been raped, the abortions through rape? It's a small percentage. I'm pretty sure it's a small percentage.
Less than 1%.
It's less than 1%. Nevertheless,
That's still a big number.
It's a big number. I cannot imagine being raped, number one. Number two, being raped and having the consequence of that rape stare you in the face, right? These are radical realities of sin, radical realities, and yet completely beyond our human scope is this idea of the good that could come from something so horrific, so violating as a life that comes from that. It is so hard to tell a woman to choose life who has been so destroyed in her body and violated, and yet it is the right thing. Yeah. It is the right thing. And to take that life, even though you may feel like your spiritual and physical life was stolen from you, to take a life in turn is not going to be the thing that sets you free.
And we have to look, women deserve better than the choice of abortion. The
That's
fact
right.
that it's an option is more detrimental. I could tell you story after story of having worked in the crisis pregnancy centers, having been in front of on the sidewalks in front of the clinics. And even, I remember debating this topic one day with one of the feminist professors at Cal State San Marcos in San Diego. And the question of rape came up over and over and over again. And I kept saying this, not only does a child, not receive the death sentence, why is it that we're justifying killing an innocent human being? But there's this, that woman, in the cases where we see women choose to have an abortion after having been raped, they themselves say that they identify then more with the rapist than as having been a victim.
Wow.
Because they identify with having done something egregious to another human being. And so it actually
it equalizes them. It stunts their healing. Yeah, I mean, so like all the medical reasons of why, but then there's the spiritual reasons. I mean, look at Christ who went to the cross, who did not deserve it.
Right.
He took the cross unto himself. Did he deserve any bit of that death, any bit of that scourge, the scourging at the pillar? He didn't deserve it. So the woman who was raped did not deserve it, want it, none of it, and yet called to bear witness to life. I mean, these are realities that are beyond our scope of understanding.
Why, God, do you even allow
Why would he permit this kind of suffering, this kind of evil, and yet he can produce Romans 8:28, the greatest good from all things. And so a woman who may not feel like she could necessarily care for that child or have that child in her life, the church is not saying you need to keep the child and raise the child. Someone else will do that. But let the child live.
Let the child live. I'm looking at a website called SaveThe1.com, and it's save the number one, actually just writing the number. And there are the stories of tons of women who chose life after having been raped. Right. And one story I recently read from there, and I'll just quote it. The woman said, "They have turned my sorrow into joy." And she's talking about
beautiful her testimony.
She's talking about her living daughter and now her grandchildren. At 18, she ended up going bowling with a group of friends she didn't know. And she doesn't remember a lot from that night, but she drank. She knows, she's certain she was drugged because when she woke up in the middle of being raped, her body couldn't even physically move to respond. And she went into a depression. As she was starting to come out of the depression and being home, she ends up discovering she's pregnant.
Oh my gosh.
And I thank God she lived in a supportive family. The story, Alexis, it's incredible. She says the day she decided to share with someone was she remembered walking into the room as her older sister was blowing up the balloons for her engagement party.
Oh my gosh.
Here she is to share that not only has she been raped, but she's pregnant.
Right. The visible sign of that violation is, and the shame with all of that. So we need to be better as a church to really pour the love on for women who are going through these horrific situations. We cannot say that these are not horrific situations. We have to identify with the pain. We have to identify with the loss of their own, lose your life to save it kind of thing. Right. No one asked to get raped. and now you have a 9-month period to have a baby, your life goes on hold. You don't know how, an 18-year-old, a college student, whatever. I mean, this is radical sacrifice. But the Lord says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be the Lord to these women and never leave them and never forsake them.
And this is my challenge to everyone listening. I think sometimes to be really pro-life is not to ever approve abortion, but to be to the point where you get it. Mm-hmm. You get where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. Women never really actually want the abortion, even if they're using a bad reason or a bad excuse for the abortion. They don't want it. And I can tell you that from having worked in the crisis pregnancy centers. It's a Band-Aid for whatever wound, relationship, sexual addiction, whatever it might be. It's a Band-Aid.
It's a Band-Aid. And there are so many women, and I meet them in my, the secular parts of my life. And a woman recently who shared with me, she knew what movie I was working on, that she had had an abortion. She hadn't told anybody, and constantly reminded of this situation. And I couldn't fix her in that moment, but I could pray for her, and I could listen to her and let her talk where she is. And then the next time I see her, see what the Lord does again. But we have to be able to let people pour out their pain and share. We know that abortion doesn't just kill the baby, it kills the mother. Mm-hmm. It kills the mother. And there are many women who are like the walking dead amongst us, suffering in secret sin and shame of having had an abortion, of never telling anyone. And the movie Unplanned is not necessarily to throw cold water on people's face and say, look what you did. It's to say, look what you can be transformed by. You may have been here like Abby, but she is a transformed woman of God, and God can use the worst to bring the best. She has led nearly over 500 abortion workers out of the business. She's touched countless people. And this is a life transformed. She's like a modern day St. Paul. And if God can do that for Abby, he can do it for anyone that's listening to this show right now.
And remember, your life can be utterly and completely changed. And we have to remember the message: women deserve more than abortion being an option on the table, because it damages them.
That's right.
We're not just talking about the life of a baby, but that mother's soul.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
And I am back with Alexis Walkenstein, and we're going to talk about living the single life you have on your website, because you talk about this in a world that doesn't wait.
That's right.
So tell me more about your message and living out a single life joyfully and chastely.
Yeah. So, living as the church teaches, waiting for marriage, and becomes a very big contradiction to the world that doesn't wait. The whole world seems to be cohabitating. I recently worked on a movie called The Dating Project, which really double-clicked on the fact that, over 50% of America is single. And I think, we were talking earlier in the show about my mom, having my sister when she was 15 and a half. And it was the lens by which I looked at not only other women like my mother, but it was the lens by which I was looking at my own life and how I was called to live my life. And initially it was kind of like, don't have sex because you'll get pregnant like your mother, and it was kind of like this fear-based reaction, knowing that the church taught that, knowing that this happened to my mother. It's like, if you have sex, you're going to get pregnant. So don't do it. But over time, and Fulton Sheen was really part of this, and John Paul too, but understanding the why, and understanding why you preserve that for the one that you're called to. And, by grace, to be able to wait and to set yourself apart, avoid scenarios that are going to put you into an occasion of sin, and not necessarily serial date like so many women. I minister to a lot of young women who feel like, if their Friday or Saturday or Monday night or Tuesday night or Thursday night is not full, and they don't have a fleet of dates lined up, and, a whole bunch of busyness going on with men, that they're nothing. And I had just kind of a different mentality, and I do believe it's grace, and I just really just praying for the one man that is set apart for me, and I'm set apart for him, that in due season he will emerge, and to really be busy for the Lord in that season. And that's a lot of my message, and to kind of bring people to the dignity of who they're called to be as men and women in radical preparation for that sacrament. The Lord has put on my heart that my marriage will be a testimony, because God is doing marriage now. He's about restoring marriage. He's about re-instructing, because the church has been remiss in this topic, slowly coming up to speed with theology of the body and some of Fulton Sheen's principles in 3 to Get Married. But the church needs to be recatechized, and young people need to be recatechized on the concept of what it means to wait, what marriage is, what sexuality is. It's not to say it's not fun, and but it's all in the marriage. It's free, faithful, total, fruitful. And we're not free if we're romping around now. We're not free, and you can't be fruitful when you're not married, and so you're putting restrictions on God. And so my message is really built through the truth of what John Paul II has delivered in his amazing witness of theology of the body, and through my recent decade-long friendship with Bishop Sheen. It was 3 to Get Married that really brought me into his fold, and it helped me to identify the reason why you wait, and that it will be worth the wait, because without Christ at the center, it's not going to be good. It's going to be vainglory. It's going to be selfish. And Fulton Sheen has some words where he says, 2 people that are not filled cannot bless each other. Basically, he says, 2 glasses of water need to have a source outside of 2 cups outside have to have a source of water outside themselves to fill them up, and that's Christ. We need the grace of Christ and the grace of the sacrament to fill us up. And so if we're living as marrieds before our time, we're getting filled up by sin. We're not getting filled up by the freedom of giving yourself as a self-donation to another.
A plain house, not just what the church is saying, but plain house, clearly shacking up. I know people who cringe now. It's so funny because I know a lot of millennials who are like, they hear the word shacking up and they're like twitching, like, please don't say those words. I'm like, there's a reason you're twitching when I say them. Yeah. But statistically, we see the likelihood that you'll ever get married decreases the moment you shack up. And the likelihood that if you get married, you stay together decreases. The likelihood of a happy first year or years of marriage decrease when you live together before marriage. I was at a wedding recently, actually, and it was so interesting because somehow it was totally a God thing, because there were so many obstacles to getting to this wedding, and I'm there and I ended up sitting with totally different people than I would have had I shown up earlier. Yeah. And it was interesting. I ended up sitting next to this one gentleman, and somehow it comes up, he hadn't brought his girlfriend to the wedding because, the next girl he was going to bring to a wedding he planned on marrying, essentially. Yet later ends up sharing that he's thinking about taking the next step and moving in together. And it was this moment to speak to, well, you're going to decrease the chance of you getting married if you do that. And he looks at me and he's like, okay, miss, like working in the Catholic world. And I said, no, it doesn't have just to do with being Catholic. Look at the sociology behind it.
Sociology. Yeah, there's all kinds of sociology behind it, never mind the spiritual consequences. But just the sociology. And then there's this whole thing with emotional chastity. I deal with, like I said, a lot of young women, and they become obsessed with someone that they're just looking at, never mind even in a relationship with.
Is it any wonder these boys are terrified sometimes of the first date?
Exactly. And so women have to be better and more formed under the dignity and the mantle of Mary. I just feel like emotional chastity is the beginning to success in all of these areas where we want to achieve the heights of his glory, and it might seem like spiritual pie in the sky to say, who could possibly wait in this generation where, like you said, the pornified culture and, all of the things around us and the way everyone else is living, the pull of the world could be so strong. And yet God will honor you if you wait. God will honor you. He will not be outdone in generosity, and he will form you the way you need to be for that marriage and that spouse, and he will form that person as well. And he can also transform someone who's been living in sin. I will say that too, because some people might be listening and thinking, I could never do this, or I have lived in sin, or I have lived with a woman or a man. You can come out of that and be totally transformed by grace and wait again and become new again.
It is so true. If we just remember that, you may be in whatever situation right now, but it's changeable. Yeah. Tomorrow is a new day. And, I think sometimes, unfortunately, people say, okay, we need to accompany people where they're at. And I agree, we do need to accompany people where we're at, but we also need to get out of the bad situations that we find ourselves in at times and recognize, like, we sometimes need to reach out and get help in order to pull ourselves out of those situations. I mean, working with college students, and I know you've seen this working with young women, I could always tell when a young woman was coming up to me dealing with a breakup, whether or not she was sexually active based on how she handled the breakup.
Exactly.
Because you are chemically bonding yourself, emotionally bonding yourself
to someone who's not committed to you.
Yes.
And, the reality is I feel very deeply that God is doing a new thing on the earth, and he's going to raise up people as witnesses in this area. It's hard. This is not easy. I'm not sitting here telling you like, oh, waiting is easy and, you set yourself apart. This is not easy. But God will do for you. I mean, to the level and degree that you collaborate with his grace, he will gift you in a way that you cannot even imagine to be able to accomplish his will. And the blessing is manifold. I mean, you do not want to be giving yourself away to someone who is not your intended.
Right.
And some of you may have done that and you're thinking, I'm broken. But God can completely restore that area of your life, can completely restore it, completely bring you to a place of chastity, perseverance, and waiting for him. The theology of the body is so powerful. One of my best friends teaches NFP and marriage preparation in the Diocese of Palm Beach. And there was a couple that came, and, half of the couples that are coming, more than half, like 90% of them are coming with one suitcase on these retreats. And they would have to say, do you want to get another bag to separate your stuff? Because you're not sharing a room, And so they were always could be.
I'm guessing this is for the engaged couples.
For God's plan for joyful marriage. And there was a couple there, and one of them was a stripper, and one of them was, like kind of benefiting from that, like going along with it. And once they heard the teaching of theology of the body, they were like practically in a fetal position, hearing the truth for the first time. Yeah. We have to be willing to speak the truth of what marriage is all about. The sexual union of spouses is the actual reflection of the Trinity's triune love. I mean, we are, the marriage embrace is the reflection of Christ on the earth. When you know what that is and the sacredness of that, and that God gives his children with such generosity, the ability to be co-creators with him. When the spouses come together and they procreate, you are co-creating with Christ into bringing forth a new life. These are profound things, and we've made them base. We've made them carnal. And again, it's not to say that it's not exciting and fun and pleasurable, but God wants all that. But we have to bring it back to the root and the fruit of what it is, and to know that it's divine. There's a divinity in all of this, that the marriage sacrament is no less than another a call of holiness. This is God calls man and woman in the sacrament through Cana, and we see the dignity of the sacrament coming as one of his first miracles.
Mm-hmm. And you have to pray for the virtue of chastity. You have to remember, chastity is a virtue, modesty is a virtue. You were talking earlier about how some girls, the first date, they're jumping on it immediately. This is the person I'm going to marry.
The women emotionalize everything, and they're visualizing every sequence of events.
Right, but it's a form of modesty in how we think, how we speak, how we interact, that if we don't learn to live modesty, not just in how we dress, but who we are, we're going to have a hard time living chastely. Someone asked me this question, and maybe, the answer to the sex abuse crisis is priests just marry. And I said, well, clearly priests are having a difficult time with the virtue of chastity. And I say this to single people as well, that if you can't be chaste outside of marriage, you're not going to be chaste inside of marriage.
That's correct.
And, maybe you have sexual wounds in your past that need healing, and God will heal you from this. But if you don't learn the virtue of chastity before you get married, you will not be chaste within your marriage, or even chaste within certain vows you take as religious.
That's right. I think that's 100% correct. And we have to trust him with all these aspects of our life, with our flesh, with our soul and our flesh, and the two are one. They're all interconnected, and we give him glory with our actions. I mean, I think the ultimate thing is, talk to me about a woman who's been living with a man for 6 or 7 years. Is she really happy? Is she happy? Does she feel like she's free in that? Is there freedom in that? Is she doing things to keep it together because there's no commitment?
What compromises are being made? That's Alexis Walkenstein. You can find more about her at radiotrending.com underneath the guests page. But where's your website, Alexis?
lexicaliblog.com.
So stay tuned for that and more from Alexis Walkenstein. Head over to radiotrending.com for more episodes and to let us know what you want to hear in the next episode.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.